This is America. Don't got you slipping up. Look how I'm living up. Police be tripping up. Yeah, this is America. Guns in my area. I got the strap. Now they always say congratulations. This is America.
Welcome to our educational series, and thank you so much for joining us today. And before we begin, we would just love to know a little bit about you. So do you mind just going into detail about who you are, where you come from, and kind of just the background before actually getting involved into your law career?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this. My name is Maritza Perez. I'm originally from a small town in northeastern Nevada called Calco. I'm a first-generation American, and I think that experience really, informed a lot of my politics. You know, I grew up in a really small conservative town that had a lot of immigrants, but I also saw that immigrants were treated as second-class citizens. And I remember from a very early age just being really angry about that and understanding that that was wrong. So from when I was a kid, I just knew that I was really passionate about justice. I was really passionate about people being treated equally. And I was very cognizant of marginalized communities because that's the community that I came from. I'm also from a really, really big family. I have 4 brothers, 4 sisters. I'm the only person in my family who, at least from the older generation, who went to college. So I'm also a first-generation college student, definitely the first person in my family to get a professional degree, first lawyer in my family. So a lot of first-generation cred that I have. But yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Okay, thank you so much for that introduction. Okay, so Maritza, I did a little bit of background checking and just kind of getting to know a little bit about your professional side, and I saw that you did Teach for America. So how did that role as an educator influence your role into transitioning in your passion for law?
Yeah, so I actually did Teach for America in between college and law school. And I did it because although I knew I wanted to go to law school, after my 4th year, I was just exhausted. I didn't want to do another writing assignment. I didn't want to open up another book. I was just so spent after 4 years of college where I wanted an academic break. And I knew I would need one because in law school, just like med school, it's really intense. And I knew that that would be like a huge academic commitment. So I thought, I'll do Teach for America. It'll be a break. Little did I know that it was really one of the most challenging things that I've done. Another reason I did it was just because I've always been passionate about giving back to the community. I also knew I wanted to be a civil rights lawyer. So I thought, education is it's a huge civil rights area. So what better way to learn about education and equality than being in the classroom? So those are some other reasons I did it. In addition to the fact that I really wanted to be a teacher of color for students of color, because growing up in a small rural town, I never had a teacher of color ever. And I always kind of felt robbed. I always thought if I had had that, maybe I would have had a teacher who had talked to me about honors classes or Ivy League schools, things that I didn't get. So I wanted to make sure that I was able to do that for other youth. So I loved that experience. It was very, very difficult. It was 2 years. After the 2 years, I really felt that I couldn't do it for another year, just because it was really, really challenging. But it did expose me firsthand to a lot of inequalities in our education system, and inequalities that people from lower incomes generally face. So I was really grateful for that experience, because I really think, I had a good background going into law school on a civil rights issue, which was something that I wanted to pursue as a lawyer.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
What kind of lessons did you take from your experience teaching for America to law school, and how did that sort of influence the career trajectory?
Yeah, so I guess the first thing that struck me about my experience in Teach for America is that I grew up low income. I grew up going to low income public schools, but I grew up in a rural place, and I didn't understand that disparity between rural poor and like urban poor, right? Because I always thought, you know, I went to like the low income public schools, but I had better schools than what I saw in my experience to Teach for America. And I think that was shocking to me because I thought I would see something that I was used to seeing. But like, I think that was like a huge thing first, was like, I don't think that people know how bad some of these schools are in terms of like just how poorly funded they are and what an injustice within, you know, just that within itself is terrible. So I think that was something that was most startling. It really opened my eyes to that. And I think a lot of people just don't realize the inequity that exists in this country. And that was something, you know, I continue to share with people because I think it's really important. It's something that we need to change. But also like working as an educator, you do see things like how like socioeconomic factors like really influence a person's path. You know, one thing that I thought of was just how easy it is to get caught up in the juvenile justice system, or how easy it is to get caught up in the criminal justice system as you like become older. So it really started to awaken me to like the school to prison pipeline, which is something I hadn't really thought of before becoming a teacher. You know, and that's certainly like why in law school, I focused on the criminal justice system. And I also like participated in fellowships and clinics where I got to study the school to prison pipeline. I think my experience as a teacher really just influenced that.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. So you mentioned that you work in civil rights law, right? Could you tell us what you do?
Yeah, so I used to, I should clarify that I used to. So when I started my legal career, I had a Social Justice Fellowship. That's a criminal justice reform fellowship. So most of the time out of law school, if you're a public interest lawyer, you get a fellowship. That's really how you get your foot in the door. Mine just happened to be this criminal justice reform fellowship. And I chose to do my fellowship at the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, MALDEF. It's a Latino civil rights law firm modeled after the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. So it's the same type of model. They do impact litigation, but they also lobby on different civil rights issues. So I was in the DC office, and I got in just at the tail end of the Obama administration, which is really exciting because that was when there was a lot of energy around criminal justice reform issues. So through that fellowship, I got to work on things like clemency, helping people get out of prison who were there for, you know, crazy drug charges. I also just got to advocate on issues that I'm passionate about, like ending the war on drugs, disproportionate representation of Latinos in the criminal justice system, strategies to end mass incarceration. So that was the bulk of my work when I started at MALDEF. My fellowship ended about a year and a half into it, and then I joined full staff. As a full staff legislative attorney, I worked on a variety of issues, including education, which is again where my teaching experience really was helpful there. Voting rights, immigration policy, employment rights, judicial nominations, in other words, fighting for who is on the federal bench, in addition to criminal justice. So I definitely did have a full plate while I was at MALDEF, but I wanted to go back to just really working on criminal justice issues. So after about 2.5 years, I left MALDEF to work at the Center for American Progress, a progressive think tank. And there I was a senior policy analyst for criminal justice reform. While I was there, I started to work very closely with Congress on different legislative pieces, on different advocacy initiatives, specifically around marijuana policy, policing, prison, and sentencing reform. I was at CAP for about 1.5 years before landing where I currently am. I'm at the Drug Policy Alliance. I'm the director of the Office of National Affairs, which just means that I really control the legislative strategy of our organization. So a lot of our job is lobbying members of Congress to do the right thing on our issues. Our whole goal is to end the war on drugs, which is like a massive undertaking. But you know, that's what I signed up for. So even though my background is an educator, but also a civil rights lawyer, currently my role is more of a legislative director.
Okay, that is amazing. And we really do appreciate the work that you're doing for our community and country. So in your opinion, how would you explain to the common person what the war on drugs is?
very first drug laws were created to target people of color. So our first anti-drug laws on the books were opium laws. And those laws were targeting Chinese immigrants in the 1800s in California. After that, we saw marijuana become criminalized. And that was really because Mexican migrants were using marijuana, so we wanted to find a way to criminalize them. So we made marijuana illegal. We saw the same thing with cocaine. In the 1930s, it became criminalized because we were targeting Black men in the South. It was like the Jim Crow era. So we've had a history of literally legalizing substances that people of color use. But not only that, like they're the ones who, even though everyone uses drugs, like if you look at just like who uses drugs, people of all demographic groups actually use drugs at the same rate. But only people of color are really targeted and punished for that drug use. So when we think about the war of drugs, I just think of it as, you know, the government throwing all of these resources to criminalize substance use, none of which, or some of which I should say, is not problematic. At the Drug Policy Alliance, we think that people should be able to use drugs if they want to. You know, it's people's bodies. As long as they're not harming anybody, they should be able to use drugs. The problem is when people use drugs problematically, we also try to throw the book at them and throw them in jail and prison and think that's going to solve the problem. When what we should be doing is making sure that we have substance misuse treatment available and on hand for people who really need it. This treatment should be affordable, it should be accessible, it should be culturally responsive, and it should not destroy a person's life. Because what we like to do in this country is, again, punish people through the criminal legal system, but that does nothing for somebody who needs help for substance misuse, and for people who are who are involved in drug activity either because they were doing it recreationally, or because they were trying to like gain something economically out of it. Either way, like, you know, we're not meeting their needs if we're throwing them in jail. If people are selling drugs, it's probably because they're having a hard time finding a job through the legal market. And I think that's a reflection of our policy failures as a country. But yet we spend millions and billions of dollars on enforcing drug laws. And it's nonsensical. Like, we still have a black market for drugs, you know, like drugs are illegally sold every day. We have plenty of drugs. In fact, like the US is a huge drug consumer, and that's why we have drugs coming in and out of the country. So the way we've approached drugs has always been through like this criminal racist like lens, but it hasn't been through a public health lens and meeting people where they are. And that's what we really try to advocate for, and you know, and try to get Congress to wrap their minds around at the Drug Policy Alliance. But you know, the drug war, I think people should realize that it's expansive. So when we talk about the war on drugs, we're not just talking about the criminal justice system, we're talking about collateral consequences. So drug use can lead to you being evicted from your home. It could lead to you losing your job. It could lead to even somebody losing their children. You know, drug use is often an excuse to like target women of color and put their children in foster care. So it's a huge apparatus, but what it basically comes down to is that we have demonized drug use without really understanding or trying to understand why people use drugs, and we're failing. If you look at our overdose rates, they're insane, they're through the roof. If you look at violence associated with drug use, again, like nothing has been done there. So I think the government needs to reflect and ask, are we properly using our resources? If we've thrown millions and billions of dollars and, you know, killed how many people, and the problem remains. I think we just really need to like drastically rethink drug policy in this country.
Okay. And that perfectly leads into the next questions in terms of what is the relationship between policing, drugs, and prison?
Yeah, so, you know, it's an interesting moment right now with all these conversations around defunding the police and reforming policing. It's something that we certainly stand behind. We've long advocated for decriminalizing drugs because criminalizing drugs is just another excuse for the police to harass people. As I mentioned earlier, people across demographic groups use drugs at similar rates, but people of color, Black and brown people in particular, continue to be the face of drug use and the people who are imprisoned for drug use. You can look at marijuana, for example. Even though white and Black people use marijuana at the same rate, Black people are 4 times more likely to be arrested and jailed for marijuana use. And while, you know, legalizing marijuana is a good start at addressing racial disparities, we know that that's not enough. So again, so while we say that, like, you know, we should decriminalize drugs because it will give the police less of an excuse to target people of color, we also have to think about other things. Like, just decriminalization itself will not work. We have to make sure that people have healthy, happy lives. We have to make sure that, like, people have a living wage, that people have a safe home to go to every night, that people have food on the table. So these are all like policy decisions that our lawmakers really need to take seriously and understand how all of these issues are interconnected. And then of course, if you first of all, if you're a person of color, you're more likely to be policed in this country. If they find contraband on you, you are more likely to get the book thrown at you. You know, data tells us that people of color are just punished more harshly by the system. So while a white individual might have the benefit of a diversion program, Black and brown people often don't get that benefit of the doubt. They are sent to trial, they are served with a sentence, and then we know that that comes with many collateral consequences. You could lose your job, your housing, your familial ties. There's a lot that comes with that. So that's really the connection there.
To go back and feed into what you were just saying is that I was also reading a paper discussing how over 90% of the Black people who do get arrested do not go through trial because they go with plea deals just because of the fear that they may receive longer sentences. So that's just like, I literally did not understand that magnitude because just when people were discussing like Black on Black crime and, you know, they're saying, oh, well, Black people also do blah, blah, blah. But then like when you look at it in the grand scheme, if you're in that neighborhood, you're going to have crime against people within that neighborhood. And that goes for any other neighborhood. So
yeah.
It's just,
That's a really good point. Like, what people need to understand is that violence is largely interracial. That means that the people who are going to hurt you are most likely to look like you. And that's because we live in a segregated society. Like, the people we interact with usually look like us, right? So we could say the same thing about white on white crime. I think it's something like more than 90% of people who are killed by white people are killed by other white people. You know, I think it's just a way to like debunk the Black Lives Matter movement.
right.
Most violence is interracial. People need to understand that. And with plea deals, yeah, that's really, really tragic. And I think that's another thing that people don't really comprehend about the system. Most people don't go to trial. It's really expensive. That's another thing, right? Like most people who are caught up in the criminal justice system are poor. Like, you can't afford to like pay a lawyer or to extend a trial, like extend your involvement in the justice system through a trial. And then also prosecutors will scare you with like, well, if you don't bargain down, you could be facing like 50 plus years, you know? So they're going to take, when they assess the risk, they're going to plea out, which is unfortunate because I think that's why we end up with a lot of people with long sentences who shouldn't be there in the first place.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, the way that the system operates doesn't make sense, but the way that you laid it out logically. I want to go back to what you said about holistic solutions that are based in communities and public health. Could you tell us a little bit about how Black and brown youth are disproportionately impacted by drugs in their community?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I think it just goes back to all the things that, you know, we've already talked about. I think a lot of Black and brown youth in this country grow up in communities that are just underinvested. Like, we don't have like the resources that our neighbors do. And there is a variety of reasons for that, but most of it is just a divestment because of racism, in my opinion. You know, and when you don't have those things, of course, like you face different decisions. I think the tragedy of it is that, again, while Black and brown individuals do use drugs, everyone uses drugs, but it hits us different. Like, you know, we have the police on us. Like, we are the ones who have to deal with the criminal consequences, where other folks might not have to. You know, so I think that's really where why the disparities are most tragic. It's we're already like facing an uphill battle, and that's certainly true of the criminal justice system.
Once someone from one of those communities enters the criminal justice system, what's different that they would experience that someone who's, say, white would not?
Mm-hmm. So one thing that immediately comes to mind is that they just face longer, Black and brown people face longer sentences, like literally for the same crime. We just face longer sentences, whether that's because the judge decided to be harsher or the prosecutor decided to be harsher on us. Like study after study shows that we are just meted out like way more intense consequences for the same crime. Also, like how we're treated once we're in the facility is also distinct. Solitary confinement, where people are kept isolated, whether it be because behavior or to keep the individual safe. It's actually been deemed torture by many countries around the world. We still use it quite often here in the US. And again, that's something that disproportionately affects Black and brown people. But, you know, I think it just goes back to seeing Black and brown people as inherently more criminal, more dangerous, something to be afraid of. We see it in the school to prison pipeline, right? If you think about who is disproportionately impacted by that, it's perception. It's you know, and I think it's like what we see with these conversations around police reform. It's, you know, like unfortunately in this country, the color of your skin does affect a lot of your life, including how people treat you and what people think of you, and even the punishments that you're doled out.
Does that disproportionality in sentencing have anything to do with representation on the bench?
That's a really good question. So I kind of think about that in the way that people say, like, if we had more diverse police officers, people wouldn't get killed by the police. I think it's beyond that. I feel like the system is not something you can diversify into functioning in a fair way. I think a lot of it just needs to be scrapped and we need to start over. I don't think a diverse police force means we're going to have less people killed by police. No, it just means we'll have Black and brown people killing Black and brown people. And with judges, you know, I do think that it's super important to have judicial diversity. In fact, it was one of the things I worked on at MALDEF. So I do think it's helpful, but it's not the answer, again, because I think the system just needs to be revamped. We need to do away with mandatory minimums that tie judges' hands. So even if a judge was someone who wanted to do something right, they might not be able to because the person in front of them is subject to a mandatory minimum because of a drug charge or something like that. So I think we needed to like just look holistically at criminal justice reform if we really want to get to the problem. And yes, judges are a part of that, but simply diversifying the bench is not enough.
That makes sense. It sounds like a massive systemic issue. So where do you think we should start with this?
I think we really start by decriminalizing drugs. I think that's the answer. I mean, if you look at, you know, if you imagine the prison and jail system as as a pie, drug convictions are a fraction of that pie. They're certainly not like the reason why most people are entrapped in the criminal justice system, but there's still a significant proportion of why people are trapped in the justice system. So I think by decriminalizing drugs, we could start to chip away at people being criminalized in the first place. The way I always think about it is, you know, my job is to, you know, make sure that no new crimes are added to the books, and then we start to take things off the books. You know, I just think about like ways to minimize contact with police, ways to minimize contact with the criminal justice system. I think drug decriminalization would go a long way in doing that. And not only because it would reduce contact with the criminal justice system, but I think if we were able to talk about drugs as a health issue and really make sure that like people had treatment, or if they didn't need treatment, if they had like the resources they needed to live healthy, productive lives, I think that could just like kind of reset our brains and the ways that we think about other things that we criminalize. You know, I think we rely on the police and the criminal justice system for things that are kind of insane and like don't belong there. And I think starting by decriminalizing drugs would help us like start to really rethink the ways that we dole out justice in this country.
As future healthcare providers or as scientists, what would be the best way that we can help alleviate or contribute to decreasing or minimizing the war on drugs?
So I think we all just need to be advocates in whatever profession we choose. We work actually with a lot of health professionals in the drug policy space because we really need, first of all, because we say like drugs are a health issue and we truly believe that. So we need to have health professionals at the table and helping us make these policy decisions because it is a health issue. So that's you know, a big reason why. But then also like I think like people in the medical field and like health professionals really carry weight with lawmakers in a way that like advocates don't, because I think we're seen as like agenda driven or whatever. But I think that speaking from a health perspective shouldn't be politicized, although we're seeing that it has been recently, but it shouldn't be, right? Like health and like science, like those things should not be up for debate. So I think, you know, having that objective voice on our issues and, you know, having folks just explain things in a way that like we can't, you know, as advocates is helpful. But I think there's definitely a role for folks. Like one thing that we've been working a lot with recently, we've been working with doctors a lot on recently is decarcerating jails and prisons. So since COVID hit the US, we've been working nonstop to try to get people out of jails and prisons because, as you all know, COVID-19 is really hard to contain in those settings because people are really close together. There's no access to PPE or like cleaning supplies or anything like that. And the infection rates are through the roof. Most of our hotspots, the majority of them right now, most of our clusters are in jails and prisons. People are being infected and dying at really insane rates. So we've been working with doctors to try to like raise that issue and like, you know, bring a light to that. And it's been helpful because again, I think they carry weight with lawmakers that we don't as advocates. They're seen as more objective without a political agenda, which is helpful. But I definitely think there's a role for health professionals to play, and I hope that you all consider advocacy in your future careers too.
Thank you. And how would be the best way to go about in becoming an advocate, even as a student?
You know, the way I kind of just fell into it was just following things that I'm passionate about. Like if you feel enraged about something, or if you feel like excited about something, I say explore that and go with it. Like, you know, I think like, especially like these last few years have been especially hard for a number of reasons, and especially angering. But I think for me, my activism and my advocacy is like a way for me to feel better about a lot of things. It's actually like done a lot, I think, for my mental and emotional health. So I think that people should pursue it. I think people think they need like a certain, like, they need to be a certain type of person or know like a lot about an issue to be an activist or an advocate. And that's not true. Like, yes, we should be well informed, but you learn as you go. You know, I didn't start out knowing everything, and I still don't know everything. You learn as you go, that with anything, right? So I think just don't be afraid to like stand up for things that you believe in. I think that's really important. And I think if more people did that, then, you know, I think we could have better outcomes in our policy decisions, because I think oftentimes people think that their voice doesn't matter, or that what they say doesn't, like, who would care about what they say. But I think we need to rise up, especially when things are problematic. Like, that's how we stop bad things from happening, and that's how we, you know, can start the ball rolling on good things that we want to happen.
That is very true. And just lastly, since we have an audience of students and educators and advocates who are really interested in the school to prison pipeline system and the war on drugs, what would be just some general advice that you would feel like you would want them to know in terms of not just being an advocate, but just kind of being informed on these issues, and maybe something that you wish you would have told your younger self on just kind of career trajectory wise, how to really stay focused and really stay motivated?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think something that's really important is to just follow like what you feel passionate about. I think sometimes people just do things because they feel like they have to, or they're subscribing to what, you know, a role they think they have to fulfill. I've always just followed what I care about. And I think that's what's led me to a really happy career where I actually enjoy my day to day. And another thing to keep in mind, I think, is that if you have a vision for yourself, like, go with that. Don't let anybody tell you that you can't do it. I remember when I was trying to go to law school, I had all these people tell me, why would you do that? There are so many lawyers, like, it is like, you know, like, law school sucks. Like, why would you like do that to yourself? Like, it's so much money, and for what? You know, people were really trying to like get that idea out of my head, but I had a vision. I said, I'm going to be a lawyer in DC. I'm going to work on civil rights issues. And I stuck with it. And I think it's really important to do that. Like, don't let people to assuage you from what you want to do, especially people who have no idea like what you're talking about. Most of the people who told me not to go to law school never went to law school. So maybe they were speaking from their own regrets or whatnot, but I think just, you know, like, stick to what you want to do. And I really think that if you do that, it'll work out. It's always ended up working out for me, even though I'm first gen everything. And, you know, I feel like a lot of time I was figuring it out as I go, like, it worked out. But it's because I stuck with it and I followed what I wanted to do.
Thank you so much for this interview and just joining. We had an amazing time.
Everybody gone bad. Situation, aggravation, everybody allegation in the suit on the news. Everybody dog.